Hello and welcome to Global Eye. With me, Parikshit Luthra. Respond, recognize, respect and reform. That was the highlight of Prime Minister Modi's message to 120 countries participating in the virtual Voice of Global South Summit. The two-day event kicked off on Thursday with an aim to unite southern nations, including countries in Asia, Africa and South America. Prime Minister Modi noted the importance of the southern part of the world, urging nations to amplify their voice and shaping the emerging order. He said the world is in a state of crisis and developing nations need to join hands to set the global agenda. This summit comes ahead of India hosting the crucial G20 summit later this year. While speaking about the challenges, Prime Minister informed the developing nations about the opportunities that lie ahead. He said, and I quote, "I remain optimistic that our time is coming. The need of the hour is to identify simple, scalable, sustainable solutions that can transform our societies and economies." End of quote. Let's listen in to the Prime Minister first.
We should together call for a global agenda of respond, recognize, respect and reform. Respond to the priorities of the Global South by framing an inclusive and balanced international agenda.
All right, to take this forward, we are now joined by former diplomats KC Singh and Anil Trigunayat. Thank you very much for joining us, gentlemen. Master KC Singh, give us a sense of the importance, the significance and the reason why India has tried this initiative for the first time. I'd just like to refer to some of the statements, some of the phrases used by Foreign Minister Jai Shankar. Global South sensitive, from self-centered globalization to human-centered globalization, from being on the receiving end of technological patronage to deploying global South-led innovations, from debt-creating projects to demand-driven and sustainable development cooperation. What is the importance and why did India go ahead for such an initiative?
Well, in some ways, it reminds me of the time when I joined the service, because in 1970s, 1980s, there used to be a Geneva Center for North-South Dialogue. Former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh used to head it at one stage. So this is a very old dialogue between the developing and the developed countries, from which we had been missing for a long time, and also the world had stopped paying attention to it. And then came G20, G7 morphed into G20. It was felt that these 20 important countries could take decisions. I think what's happened now is that because of the division between the permanent members of the Security Council over Ukraine war and the standoff with China, many of the old structures have become dysfunctional. Now, G20 is not going to, we saw what happened in Indonesia. Russian president was not there. There's an ongoing war. And between the epidemic, the COVID epidemic and the Ukraine war, the current ailments of the world, economic ailments, are flowing from those two events. Supply chains are interrupted. You've got inflation, food price inflation, energy inflation, and the developing countries are hit the worst. And just coincidentally, India has got the chair of G20. So Prime Minister is trying to use that position to see if there could be some dialogue again and focus back. And now one of the other thing which happened is in January, we've gone to a green hydrogen initiative of India. So last year, focus has again come back to environment. One is, of course, inflation and energy inflation. Second is how do you decarbonize? Because environment focus had gone off it for almost a couple of years and is back again on it. So as you decarbonize, as the world moves towards green hydrogen, India can sense it that you can reconstruct the engagement between the developed and the developing world. You can't again leave the developing world behind, because which are the countries benefiting from a carbon-favored economic structure? It is the developed countries and the petro-states. The developing countries are always at the receiving end. So can we transition to a more equitable order? I think that's what needs to be done. It's a highly ambitious call. Doubtful if you can do it in a year, which is what her presidency is. But it's always good to put the agenda on the table.
Right. Ambassador Trigunayat, of course, planning for an event of this magnitude would have possibly begun a few months ago. but this is not happening in person. Seems to have been decided not too far long ago. Do you think there could be any reason for thinking about such an event and trying to do it as soon as possible? Because it was only last week when the Foreign Secretary did a press conference saying that a new initiative is being announced.
Well, I think that there has been, nothing happens overnight, as simple as that. I mean, the missions would have been advised quite well in advance to find out whether the heads of the missions or heads of the governments, heads of the presidents are available or not, foreign ministers, because in every panel there is a ministerial dialogue. And therefore, this is not something that can just come out in a short time. So since India took over its G20 presidency only in December, on December 1st, so it's just about a month and a half hardly that we have passed on. And we have said that from the very beginning that India wishes to continue to be the voice of the Global South. Because this is not the first time, and as Ambassador Singh has mentioned, that we have had various meetings in the past. India has been a leader of the Global South from the time of its independence, even before that, till recently. I mean, all through, whether it is in the pandemic or otherwise. So India has always stood. But when you want to become a voice of the Global South, what happens is that you cannot presume that you know what the Global South wants. So therefore, this initiative that we must find out from those leaders exactly what is their focus so that that can be channeled into the G20 discussions. Because G20 discussions and the final outcome in the form of the declaration has to be a consensus-based document. So therefore, it is important that the key issues, everybody knows what it is, as Prime Minister Modi in his 4 hours mentioned, or the 8 priorities that have been discussed during these meetings. So they are very much there. India has been talking about it during its presidency of the presidency of the Security Council, which just ended. So I think that this has been going on for quite some time, and India is known and has shown, actually, whether it was during the pandemic or otherwise, in every which fora we talk about. So everywhere that the voice of the Global South needs to be told, focused, in a focused manner. Secondly, we need to, as Prime Minister said, that we need to escape the cycle of dependency on systems and circumstances that are not of our creation. So the decisions are taken by the Global South. If the war happens between Russia and the United States into Ukraine, then the whole world is suffering. And which countries are suffering the most? If the pandemic happens, we see the vaccine apartheid, we see the now green apartheid. So the countries that are suffering, which are the ones? It's the Global South. So they're developing countries. And as was mentioned earlier, that it is also even the environmental benefit will eventually pass on to the countries of the Global North. So therefore, it is important that you create a kind of leeway in the discussion with the developed world so that the common and differentiated responsibility principle remains on board, and whatever is required to bring the Global South onto the level is done. And that's what India is trying to do in every which fora.
Right. Okay, that's an important point. But Ambassador K.C. Singh, let's just talk about the influence of China in continents, in nations which comprise the Global South, Asia, Africa, South America. What are China's stakes here, and how is India trying to counter the influence of China? One important point that strikes me is the issue of mounting debt. How important is this in the context of what India is trying to do?
See, in that, China's both can provide a solution, but is also part of the problem. 2 other countries facing economic distress in South Asia. We've seen the economic meltdown in Sri Lanka, largely engendered by the Chinese contribution to their debt and building infrastructure which has been non-productive. Same is the case with Pakistan, and Pakistan is just on the verge of economic collapse. And there is, of course, political collapse. So there is this issue, and that is the problem, that because of the divergence of interest between China and India, there's convergence and there's divergence on some issues, on issues of environment, global trade remaining open, etc., new conditionalities not being put, non-tariff barriers not being imposed. China and Indian interests are convergent. But then they're divergent in this. The army chief just said a day ago that we are finding more troops moved to the northeastern line of actual control across from Arunachal Pradesh. So if China is going to be doing this, that territorially in the maritime boundaries as well as on the continent is going to be asserting itself and behaving aggressively, then it hardly remains a partner. How do you? And there is, of course, the common sense understanding that the Chinese would not want India to assume global leadership. They want to contain India and leave India to a South Asian subsector. So through this G20 chairmanship, India is assuming leadership. Don't forget that Prime Minister Nehru was a very predominant leader in the early 60s, late 50s, early 60s, as much of a standing or greater acceptability than Mao had. And then came the 62 war. So Chinese have multiple factors, and one of them is keeping India constrained. Whereas India, by saying we are assuming the leadership of the global South, it's trying to, and that's why Chinese, when they got involved with G77, they never joined it. They said the group began to be called G77 plus China. They said we don't want to be in that group. That is a group of the developing countries, which became more than 77. It became 100 and something. But the Chinese have this habit of saying that we are now more under President Xi Jinping than ever. They want to be a pole. They want to be considered an equal of the United States. And in this competition, space for India to be determining the agenda and playing the arbiter is, I think, limited.
Okay. 120 countries participating. How do you think, Ambassador Trigunayat, is the Ukraine-Russia war driving this strategy? One of the problems that everyone has seen over the last 1 year is food and energy prices, high volatility there, fertilizer shortage impacting the agricultural sector across developing nations. Give us a sense of how the war is driving India's strategy, and can there be some consensus on supply chains?
Well, I think that these 3F crises that you mentioned, which has come out essentially out of the Russia-Ukraine war, and as I mentioned earlier, has basically impacted a great deal the countries in the global South, because they are dependent on these imports, whether it is food, whether it is fuel, or fertilizer for that matter. And therefore, the politicization or weaponization of these instruments has really done a great harm to the world. And that's one thing that India has in its G20 agenda, is how to depoliticize or this globalization which is happening, how to contain that. That is something extremely important. So that these issues are basically the essentials are kept out of it. So Russia-Ukraine war, as you know, that nearly it's stymied the Indonesian presidency, where India did play a role in bringing out some kind of a Bali declaration with some references. And this continues to remain a challenge because this war is not ending right now, we have seen, and it is unlikely to end so soon. So therefore, the problem for India is how it is going to contain the bad effects of the war in the first place, and can it play some kind of a role in bringing about the two sides to the table. Now, whether Russia, Ukraine agree eventually out of fatigue, out of going out of weapon systems or whatever it is, somehow, if it stops, then it makes India's case a little bit better. But if the war continues and the situation continues to be there, the other countries are all involved. Global, we are looking at the recession in the Western countries. We are also looking at the world heading towards a Cold War 2.0 kind of situation. And therefore, I think that what India can eventually get is being a voice of the Global South means what we did during the time of the NAM. We could perhaps, as I always say, emerge as the leader of the nations for a strategic autonomy.
All right, we've run out of time, but Ambassador Trigunayat, Ambassador KC Singh, thank you very much for joining us, putting the Voice of the Global South Summit in perspective for our viewers. On that note, we will take a short break, but don't go anywhere. India and the United States have ruled out a mini trade deal agreement between the two nations in the near future. A special discussion with Atul Kashyap, President at US-India Business Council. Stay tuned.